Welcome to our discussion on systems documentation. Systems documentation is like a picture book of what goes on in our accounting information system. As you can see at the right, we have a subsection of the documentation about the payroll process for an organization. This documentation shows pictorially how a system works, including the 4 different components of an accounting information system: data entry, data processing, data storage, and information output, as well as the controls that protect and guide each of those processes. Just like a good picture book has both story, words, and pictures, system documents are accompanied by narrative, which are a written step-by-step explanation of the system components and its interactions. The image at left shows the payroll process used in an organization. Specifically, it shows the process by which the accounting manager enters the cash disbursements for payroll into the general ledger. Without the narrative, the documentation is only so clear, but when you add the narrative, it becomes a great deal more obvious what is going on. Again, both the systems documentation and the narrative are an important component of systems documentation. There are 3 primary groups of users of systems documents: systems developers, managers, and auditors. System developers use systems documents to both demonstrate the flow of information through a system, as well as work with the managers to help design the system. Managers use systems documents to train new employees on how the system works, to facilitate communication about the system, and, in conjunction with the system developers, identify opportunities for improvements. The third primary group of users of systems documents are auditors. Following the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002, auditors were required to understand the system and the internal controls embedded within the system. Auditors may create systems documents or use the systems documents already in place to meet this purpose. For the purpose of this class, our primary focus will be on flowcharts, which are a pictorial analytical technique used to describe some aspect of an information system in a clear, concise, and logical manner. There are 3 primary types of flowcharts. The first is the document flowchart, which shows the flow of documents and data among areas of responsibility in an organization. A subtype of the document flowchart is the internal control document, which shows where the controls exist in a process. A second type of flowchart is the system flowchart, which shows the relationships among the 4 components of an accounting information system: input, process, output, and storage. A specific component of a system flowchart is the program flowchart, which illustrates the sequence of logical operations performed by a computer in executing a program. There are 4 key types of flowchart symbols: those related to inputs and outputs, those related to processing, those related to storage, and those related to the flow of information. We have both manual processing symbols and electronic processing symbols pictured here. In the input-output column, we see the pink swirly documents in single and multiple, as well as system input and system output. Processing column, the rectangle indicates a computerized or automated process, whereas the trapezoid indicates a manual process. The green storage column, the cylinder indicates the database, whereas the icon that looks like a tape measure indicates where manual records are stored in a magnetic tape. The parallelogram shape indicates storage in a general ledger, and the triangle indicates filing on a process of a manual document. In the final column, the flow documents, the base-shaped icon indicates connection to another process off page, while the circle indicates connection to something on the same page. The diamond indicates a decision point, and the pill-shaped box indicates the beginning or the end of a process. Let's look at the 5 primary rules of thumb for using system maps. To illustrate these rules of thumb, we'll look at the payment of an invoice for the cash disbursement process. The 5 rules of thumb are: show the origination and disposition of all documents, indicate who performs the process, identify the internal controls within the process, follow a logical order, and use written comments and clarification to facilitate user understanding. Let's look at these in more detail. First rule: in order for your flowchart to be understanding, you have to show where the documents and processes start and where they end. In this cash disbursement process, we see the process originating with the receipt of an invoice from a vendor. As we move through the process, we see that records and documents are disposed in the accounts payable subsidiary ledger, in the cash disbursements journal, filed as a canceled invoice, remitted with the check to the vendor. But our process flow diagram has this random journal that has no beginning, even though it has an end with the accounts payable subsidiary ledger. To make this document more complete, we might add a connection line showing that the cash disbursements clerk has entered the transaction in the journal, and that this same journal is reviewed by the accounts payable clerk when they update the disbursement and update the account payable subsidiary ledger. Indicate which person or role performs the applicable step or action. This can be done by using multiple start points, as we see in the first column with from vendor. But you can also use swim lanes, which are lines of demarcation between the different processes. Here we see that 3 process areas are involved in the cash disbursement process: the accounts payable clerk, the cash disbursements clerk, and the treasurer. Next, internal controls inherent within the process. As a way of review, our internal controls are almost the behind-the-scenes ninjas that either prevent bad stuff from happening or can be used to detect when bad stuff happens so that you can correct it. Here on the process, there are a couple of internal controls. First is the lines of demarcation, or the segregation of duties between the accounts payable clerk, the cash disbursements clerk, and the treasurer. These lines of demarcation ensure that one person can't do the job with one hand and cover the job up with another. Another internal control is the approval step, which takes place before the check goes out the door. Another internal control is record keeping. The cash disbursements clerk cancels the invoice before it gets filed. This prevents the invoice from being paid multiple times. An auditor might look at this diagram and notice the missing control at the initiation of the process. Were I building this process flow, you would be joined by the purchase order and the receiving order to make sure that the purchase was authorized before you begin the payment process and that you have actually received the goods before you pay the invoice. The flow chart should follow a logical order. It should start in the top left and flow from top to bottom and left to right. The process flow diagram should also follow the logical sequencing as the process would flow in real life, and each symbol on the chart should be labeled. If you can't figure out what to label the symbol, you probably don't need it in the process. One symbol I would like to point out is the green triangle with the letter D. This indicates that the canceled invoice is filed somewhere. The narrative would tell us where file D is. And finally, use written comments and clarification to facilitate user understanding. Part of this is embedded in the narrative, but you can also use footnotes at the bottom of your process flow diagram, as well as callouts to help the user understand even more clearly what's going on. The following are examples of decision charts that I found on the internet when I was preparing this lecture. Take a couple of seconds to review each flowchart and see where you could make improvements to better fit the rules of thumb that we just discussed. And I'll give you about 10 seconds on this one. Relatively simple decision chart as it shows my thought process when I back my car out of my driveway every morning to head to campus to deliver my lectures and hold office hours. There's a few minor improvements that can be made to this flowchart. First, we typically use diamonds to indicate where we make decisions. Second, we show the end of the process with the pill-shaped form. Otherwise, this flowchart is simple and good. It has a clear beginning, it has a clear terminus, it flows in the logical order that you would make the decision in. To make it look better, you might rearrange it this way, beginning with a decision diamond at the top of the chart and showing the two arrows to the process, decisions and ends. Now let's practice applying the rules of thumb for flowcharts with this decision tree, one that's used to evaluate whether you should stay in a relationship or go. And I will give you about 10 seconds to review this and identify where you can improve it. What I like about this flowchart is that it has a clear beginning. Is the relationship working? That clear beginning is indicated by a diamond, which we use to note a decision. Beyond that, this diagram gets confusing. We have decisions that are shown as a process or a simple question and not by a diamond. We've got beginnings and ends that are shown by rectangles and not the pill shape. And we've got this end process that's linked back to the beginning. It's true that relationships are cyclical and you should periodically evaluate whether it makes sense to stay in that relationship. But the line showing the continuation of the cycle from the yellow rectangle to the green diamond makes the chart difficult to understand. So we can fix this chart. We could start with the decision diagram diamond, as we saw in the previous slide, and show the outcomes from that decision. If the relationship is working, you stay in the relationship, be happy, and enjoy the magic. But if it's not working, you need to decide if it can be fixed or not. If it can't be fixed, then you get to another terminus of the process, breaking up. But if the relationship can be fixed, you find yourself back at the first terminus. Be happy and enjoy the magic. If it might work and it might not work, then you make a process happen. Give it your best shot. If it doesn't work, you end up back at the second terminus. But if it kind of worked, you accept the imperfect status quo out of fierce love and optimism for as long as it lasts. Here's an example of a flawless flow chart. It was clearly designed by an engineer. In fact, my dad, a former engineer, now retired, used this decision-making process all the time. It starts with the diamond. It has a clear decision point and movement. It moves to another decision point, and it shows the terminus of the process. Either not a problem, use duct tape to keep it from moving, or WD-40 to get it moving. Flowcharts are fun tools that can help you understand a process. And we'll be using flowcharts from here on out to understand in more depth the accounting process in our Systems Understanding Aid.